We cover here gender, sex, and sexuality, the fluidity of maleness and femaleness. These slides come from our text, the publishers of our text, asking questions about cultural anthropology, and also from my own research and information. This comes from chapter 10 of our text. And some of the questions we'll be covering include how and why do males and females differ? Why is there inequality between men and women? What does it mean to be neither male nor female? And is human sexuality just a matter of being straight or queer? The image that you see here on this slide that during the Liberian Civil War, there were rebels who cross dressed, and it's a representation of a subtle expression of alternative masculinity and warriorhood. In this chapter, we're concerned with how the relations of gender and sex shape people's lives. And in response to that, we are going to cover these objectives to identify cross cultural variations in gender linked behaviors, to understand the limits of a sex gender dichotomy, and clarify the biocultural basis of male and female differences and similarities, clarify and assess arguments about men being the quote stronger unquote sex and women being the weaker quote unquote sex, and describe the gender identities and sexualities of people who are neither male nor female. If we ask the question, how and why do males and females differ, we can begin by talking about gender, or what it means to be a man, woman, or other identity, as well as sex and sexuality are as artificially constructed as any other aspect of culture. And the thing that's always interesting many times to students is the fact that many cultures don't share Western culture's basic male female, man woman, straight queer dichotomies. The role of biology is most discernible among young children. As children get older, cultural influences on behavior become much stronger, and it becomes difficult, if not possible, to isolate biological influences on what it means to be male or female. A sexually dimorphic species, when compared to other primates, humans are moderately dimorphic. Anthropologists sometimes use the term chromosomal sex because males have X and Y chromosomes and females have two X chromosomes. But dichotomies between the sexes do break down and blur. Men have testes, a penis, and various internal structures and hormones that support the delivery of urine and semen. Secondary effects of these hormones include deep voices, facial hair, and in some cases, pattern baldness. Females have ovaries, hormones, and an internal structure such as fallopian tubes that support the movement of ova, pregnancy, and fetal development, and whose secondary effects include breast development and a high voice. This is part two of our discussion of gender, sex, and sexuality. And we begin by looking at the gender unicorn, which is produced by the Trans Student Educational Resources. And here we see some important definitions and ideas that are reflected on this. First off, by looking at this gender unicorn, we're looking at the idea that gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, and emotional attraction are on a scale, and we'll talk about that further on a continuum, if you will. And so we begin by looking at gender identity. Gender identity, a definition would be one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both, or another gender or genders. Everyone has a gender identity, including you. For transgender people, their sex assigned at birth and their own internal sense of gender identity are not the same. Female, woman, and girl, and man, male, man, and boy are also not necessarily linked to each other, but are just six common gender identities. If we look now at gender expression or presentation, that means the physical manifestation of one's gender identity through clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, etc. Most transgender people seek to make their gender expression, how they look, match their gender identity, who they are, rather than their sex at birth. Sex assigned at birth. The assignment and classification of people as male, female, intersex, or another sex is based on a combination of anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes. It is important that we don't simply use sex because of the vagueness of the definition of sex and its place in transphobia. Chromosomes are frequently used to determine sex from prenatal karyotyping, although not as often as genitalia. Chromosomes do not determine genitalia. If we move down to sexually attracted to, which also we sometimes think about sexual orientation, it's important to note that sexual and romantic emotional attraction can be from a variety of factors, including but not limited to identity, gender expression, presentation, and sex assigned at birth. If we think about romantically attracted to, romantic emotional orientation, it's important to note that sexual and romantic emotional attraction can be from a variety of factors, including but not limited to gender identity, gender expression and presentation, and sex assigned at birth. And as we look at the gender unicorn, we see the various aspects that are covered here when it comes to understanding the ideas about gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, physical attraction, as well as emotional attraction. What does it mean to be neither male nor female? In some societies, individuals live their lives as neither male nor female without social stigma, and in some cases, it is even a prestigious status. Coupled with such variation are sexual preferences, which intersects in complex ways with gender variance. In other words, gender variance does not necessarily imply variations in sexuality. An example would be among the Navajo. The Nadlihe individuals combine male and female roles and characteristics and are highly respected, participating in religious ceremonies and acting as spiritual healers and go betweens in arranging marriages and mediating conflicts. Many young Navajos are now being labeled gay or lesbian, adopting Western forms of identification in place of traditional Navajo genders. If we look on this slide, we can see that unlike traditional gender variance in American Indian societies, many contemporary two spirit individuals identify as gay. Due to anti gay sentiment, two spirit Navajo Nadlihe often experience hostility and discrimination in their home communities. They also feel alienated from white, gay, and lesbian communities and political activism, which do not acknowledge their unique cultural heritage and the issues of poverty and racism they face as Indians. In India, Hedras are defined as males who are sexually impotent, either because they are born intersex or because they were castrated. The primary role of hedras is to provide blessings when a boy is born or at a wedding to bless the couple's fertility. Since the days of British colonialism, there have been attempts to outlaw hedras, but the Indian gender sex system still considers the combination of male and female as valid and meaningful. If we look at the image in this slide, the hedras pictured here are protesting against Indian Penal Code Section 377, which penalizes same sex relationships. Protesters sought to overturn the law, alleging that the law, which was created during the British colonial era, is outdated and justifies daily abuse and harassment of members of the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities, including hedras, by police. In the United States, transgender is a general term describing transsexuals, transvestites, drag queens, drag kings, and intersex. Many of the people who occupy this category do not necessarily identify themselves as transgender. So if we ask the question, is human sexuality just a matter of being straight or queer? Today, anthropologists emphasize that human sexuality is not a straight queer dichotomy. The individual sexuality is flexible, occurring along a continuum from asexuality or non sexuality to polyamory or the love of many. Some anthropologists reject the notion that sexuality is in essence buried deep in a person's psychological self or genetic makeup. Instead, some anthropologists argue that sexuality is learned, patterned, and shaped by the cultural context in which one lives. Again, when we talk about being culturally constructed, there are some anthropologists who do hold that notion when it comes to the ideas about sexuality. Sexuality and identity. Biologist Alfred Kinsey, pictured here, conducted a series of studies in the 1940s that led to his conclusion that sexuality exists along a continuum. His work was highly controversial during a period in American history when homosexuality and heterosexual promiscuity were considered unacceptable. Today, anthropologists emphasize that human sexuality is a highly flexible phenomenon, while also being careful not to exaggerate its centrality in people's lives. Ellen Lewin writes, like other people, lesbians and gay men identify themselves along a number of axes, and while sexual orientation is often a salient dimension of their identification, other personal and social characteristics also feed into how they view themselves. Let's take into consideration some same sex practices in different cultures. In some cultures, same sex behaviors exist side by side with heterosexual behaviors, suggesting that our assumptions in the West, in the United States, about sexuality are not universally applicable. The first example ritualized homosexuality among the Samba people, documented by Gilbert Hurt in 1981. He was criticized for using the word homosexuality since its emic purpose is more tied to symbolically developing masculine strength. Young boys, as a part of their initiation process, were required at the time to perform fellatio on older men. The idea that it developed them into strong men, that boys were not born with semen and had to get it from an external source. Hong Kong only affairs. Some married Filipino women who work as domestic maids in Hong Kong have Hong Kong only affairs with other women that have more to do with context than innate sexuality, as these women do not self identify as lesbians. Distinction in certain Latin American contexts. In some Latin American countries, passivity and activity are critical distinctions. A man who penetrates another man would not consider himself or be considered by others as homosexual. Yet, the man being penetrated would be considered homosexual. We see this further when we talk about, for example, HIV/AIDS and homosexuality. Locally variable terms to describe sexuality are more than academic concern. For example, in HIV/AIDS education campaigns in Latin America, they fail to account for the active passive distinctions that we just talked about. As a result, many men who did not identify as homosexual but were identified as homosexual by foreign medical agencies did not take necessary precautions to prevent the spread of HIV. I know that in my own work as an HIV/AIDS program manager and educator, one of the things that we were very careful to do was to talk about behavior rather than labels. So we would use the term men who have sex with men to describe behavior because we knew that we were missing a whole group of men who fell into this same kind of distinction, that if they were the active partner, they didn't consider themselves to be homosexual and that the messages didn't apply to them. Controlling sexuality. Some of the most divisive political issues in the United States, abortion, gays in the military, same sex marriage, sex education, involve questions over whether and how the government should control the sexuality of its citizens. What do you make of China's one child policy? It successfully reduced fertility rates and unemployment, but it's also created strict government control over sexuality, including draconian measures like, until 2002, when it was outlawed, forced abortions and sterilizations of women who exceeded their quota or were deemed unfit to reproduce. And as we close out this section, we'll just once again review our learning objectives, the things that we have covered in both parts of this discussion. Number one was to identify cross cultural variations in gender linked behaviors. The second objective was to understand the limits of a sex gender dichotomy and clarify the biocultural basis of male and female differences and similarities. The third objective was to clarify and assess arguments about men being the stronger sex and women being the weaker sex. And the fourth was to describe the gender identities and sexualities of people who are neither male nor female. This concludes our discussion on gender, sex, and sexuality.